And we'll jump right into it here. We're in 2 Corinthians, and I've got the map up here. I didn't know if I'd be able to get my computer to work on there, and I did, so I have it there, which is bigger than this, but I put this here in case that didn't work. So you've got both. And if you remember when I had taught through Corinthians, the Pauline epistles and Acts, I always had a map up, and to me, it actually helps me to remember everything. And that was just me. Some people don't need a map, but Corinth is right here on the map, okay? And that's Greece. What we know is Greece right now. There's Corinth, okay? And Paul's home church is over here in Antioch. That's the church that sent him out. Is Antioch in Syria. Jerusalem's south over here. And on that second missionary journey, Paul he goes up in here, Galatia and all that. He goes back to these churches from the first missionary journey that he had gone to. I'm just kind of setting the table because chapter 10, where we're at, Paul defends his ministry. And if you don't remember all the background information of the way this church was founded and the controversies that were kind of involved from 1 Corinthians, then it's easy to maybe not understand why he's saying what he's saying in these chapters we're going to look at. So I thought I'd kind of reset the table a little bit. So if you know the background story on the second missionary journey, after he had gone through confirming the faith of the churches that he had originally started in the first missionary journey, because this is a map of the second missionary journey, by the way. And he picks up Timothy here, Lystra and Derbe. He picks up Timothy, and he visits Galatia and all that. And he intended to go into Asia over here. He intended to go into all this area over here. And in Acts chapter 16, if you remember, he had that vision of the man of Macedonia saying, come over here. That was not Paul's intention. He had no intention of coming up over into Macedonia. This is Macedonia right here. I don't know if it's the way it's written on this map. It's kind of vertical, starting from the bottom, Macedonia. You see it there. And that's where Philippi and Amphipolis and Apollonia and Thessalonica and Berea, they're all in Macedonia. So in Troas, he picked up Luke. I won't rehash all that, but if you're familiar with the book of Acts, that's why Acts is like absolutely foundational for everything you read in the Pauline epistles. You got to get Acts down. You have to get Acts down. If you don't get Acts down, you're going to get screwed up in the epistles, or you're not going to get what you could get out of it. I guess I'll put it, maybe you won't get screwed up, but you're not going to get everything that you could get. If you don't really nail down Acts, and the cast of characters and the places that he went and the background information. And like Philippians is a little richer to me because I remember how it was founded. Who was it that he started the church with? It was the women at the river that were praying. There were no synagogues there, so he couldn't go to the synagogue, which is always the first place he went to in every city. This was different. This was totally different. Philippian jailer, all that stuff. And of course, they were instrumental in paying him, I guess, or helping him to minister to Corinth, and he brings that up in this chapter here, in chapter 10 and 11, when he's defending his ministry. So it's important you know that. I mean, you just get more out of it when you understand all the background information. So he picks up Luke here in Troas. So at a minimum, he's got, Timothy, and Silas came with him too. Silas was from Jerusalem. And when he came up with those letters from Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, he didn't go back home. He stayed because he wanted to go with Paul. Paul and Barnabas have that falling out because of John Mark. And so Barnabas and John Mark go to their home of Cyprus, and they go back and minister to those churches they started in the first missionary journey. Then Paul and Silas pick up Timothy. Then they pick up Luke. And then they cross the Aegean Sea here, this little area right here, and they end up in Philippi. And you know the story of Lydia and the Philippian jailer, and starts a church there. And then he goes through Macedonia, goes to Thessalonica. Of course, the Jews run him out of town there, and he runs to Berea. And the Bereans were those that searched the scriptures daily, whether those things were so. They were commended for that. They were more noble than those of Thessalonica. You know that story. The Jews run him out of town there. He kind of takes off on a ship to avoid getting killed. He leaves Silas and Timothy behind because he has to flee so quickly. He ends up in Athens, Acts chapter 17. He preaches on Mars Hill. does that whole thing there with the Gentiles. Then he ends up in Corinth, and he meets Priscilla and Aquila. They were also tent makers like he was. And he meets them there, starts the church there. And if you go to Acts chapter 18 and look at that real quick. Actually, I need to turn my notebook to my notes. Still in 1 Samuel there. Okay. So if you go to Acts chapter 18, I think it's important that you see this because not everybody in Corinth was led to the Lord by Paul. Paul started the church. But if you understand the background information, there's some people in that church that don't even know Paul. They got saved after Paul was gone, after he left. Although he spent 18 months there. But I'll show you what I'm talking about. So in the book of Acts in chapter 18, which is where this account occurs, right? Because everything I told you is found in the book of Acts, right? So we're only at Acts chapter 18 in chronological time when he gets there. And it says here, 17 is not going to help me, 18. So, verse number 1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. So this is Paul's first time in Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, and his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. Now, seems like there's a lot of extraneous information there. They're from Italy and all this other kind of stuff. Well, it's important that you understand that too, because at the end of Romans chapter 16, when Paul is writing to the Romans, he tells them, hey, say hi to Aquila and Priscilla. That's where they're from. But they had to leave because of Claudius. But at some point they were able to go back. So that years later when Paul's on his last journey and he's leaving, and he's writing Romans there, right before he gets back to Jerusalem. I believe he wrote Romans in Ephesus, or even in Corinth, just as he was picking up the offering to take it to Jerusalem. Anyway, I don't want to tell you the whole story because then I'd just be doing Acts. I'm supposed to be doing 2 Corinthians chapter 10. So he gets there, he meets these tent makers, and this was right after he left Athens and came to Corinth. And then you just go down to say verse number 11. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months. So he's there 18 months. It's a long time. He was there 18 months, teaching the word of God among them. Now, what was he teaching? He wasn't teaching the New Testament. It wasn't even written. He's teaching them Jesus out of the Old Testament. That's something that you need to be able to do. If Paul could do it, why can't you do it? I think it's important. You should be able to teach Jesus out of the Old Testament so that if you're ever witnessing to a Jew, you can go to his scriptures and show him Jesus. Right. And when Gallio was because he doesn't care if you point to Romans chapter 10. What does he care about Romans? You know what I'm saying? You don't care. I'm a Jew. You point me to Moses and maybe you got something. Verse number 12. When Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, and that's the region, so we now call Greece, Achaia is that area over there where Corinth is. The Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. So, of course, the Jews stir up trouble again, right? They've been chasing them all across the whole area, from one city to the next. So they take him up in front of the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will be no judge of such matters. He's like, you're not going to get me wrangled up in one of your religious, conflicts. I don't care about your religion. If he's violated a law, like some civil law or something, all right, I'm your guy. But if this is just between you guys about God, get lost. That's basically what he's saying. Take a hike. You're not gonna hook me into that mess. You know what I'm saying? He doesn't want any part of that beehive. Yeah. So verse 16, and he drave them from the judgment seat. So get out of my courtroom. Get out of here. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat, and Gallio cared for none of those things. They basically beat this guy Sosthenes. The text doesn't even tell you why they're picking on Sosthenes. It's just like they're mad, so they randomly pick this guy up and beat him. and the judge doesn't even do anything about it. He just looks the other way and just lets it go. But who is this Sosthenes guy? Why are they beating him up? This was about Paul, I thought. Well, I believe he was saved. I believe Paul led him to the Lord. Why do I believe that? Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Again, it helps to know your cast of characters, and that's how you pick up this stuff. So, he spent 18 months there in Corinth. But right after this, and we're going to go back to chapter 18 real quick too, because I want to introduce you to Apollos. So after he leaves Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila go with him to Ephesus. Well, I believe he took Sosthenes with him too. And here's why. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse number 1. Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes our brother. Well, he's writing this letter from Ephesus to Corinth. They know Sosthenes, right? Because he's from there. You just saw him get beat in Corinth at the judgment seat. So I think Sosthenes left Corinth with Paul and Priscilla and Aquila and ended up at Ephesus. And so now when Paul's writing back, their friend is, through Paul, is saying, hey, make sure you mention me in there, Paul. Let them know I say hello. So he does. So the letter is addressed from Paul and Sosthenes unto the church of God which is at Corinth. So back in Acts chapter 18, so in verse number 18 of chapter 18, and Paul after this tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. And he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they desired him to tarry longer with them, he consented not. So Paul goes to Ephesus, drops off at a minimum Priscilla and Aquila. I believe Sosthenes was there with him, but he could have come a little later, because there's been time that's passed, so Sosthenes could have journeyed there on a separate trip. But minimum, Priscilla and Aquila are there. And so now Priscilla and Aquila are left at Ephesus. Now, we don't know Paul ever having been to Ephesus prior to this. So he either started a church real quick and then took off to Jerusalem, or Priscilla and Aquila got things rolling. But either way, there's a church at Ephesus, because he ends up going back there. But he leaves to Jerusalem because he's always had a heart for his people, so he's constantly trying to win them to the Lord. And he had a vow, he made a vow, so he was going to go to Jerusalem, and he left Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, right? Here's Ephesus. Oops, let me get my pointer right here. Ephesus is right here, right? So he came back from Corinth and came to Ephesus here, and then he went down to Jerusalem, but Priscilla and Aquila stayed there. So while Priscilla and Aquila are still there, Paul's absent, Paul's not there now. Verse number... Well, let me keep reading there. Verse number 22. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch. Of course, you got to remember, down in our vernacular, when we're talking about maps, we're thinking north, south, east, west. Down is south. Down's not south. Not in the Bible. Down is elevation. So Jerusalem's on a mountain down here. He came after he left Priscilla and Aquila, he came to Jerusalem, but he went up to Jerusalem, right? You're always going up to Jerusalem. That's the only way to get there. You got to go up. It's on a mountain. Antioch's north, and Antioch's up here. Jerusalem's not even on your map. It's down here. So he went to Jerusalem, then he went down to Antioch. But it's kind of backwards to how we talk, right? So, if you don't know your geography in your mind's eye, you're thinking he's going south, but he's not. He's going north. But he had to go down to Antioch because he had to come down from the mountain, right? So he went down in elevation, but he was going north. And then he went back to his home church in Antioch, Syria. Verse 23, and after he had spent some time there, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. In verse number 24, and a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. So in the meanwhile, Apollos shows up at Ephesus, right? Paul's not there. Paul's over here doing his thing. He come up, and going back over here to these other churches that were already started, and he's kind of strengthening them. Meanwhile, at Ephesus, Apollos shows up. Verse 25, this man was instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. So he knew a lot, but he didn't know it all, right? A lot of things changing right here. Paul's going around preaching. Apollos is totally oblivious to what Paul knows, but he is still here commended for what he did know, because he knew everything he could know, apparently. But he hadn't knew the new revelation from Paul. And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom, when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. So now, Paul's disciples are discipling Apollos in Ephesus while Paul's not there. And I love that it says, when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly. So apparently, I know I'm stepping on eggshells right here, but I don't care. This is what the Bible says. Apparently, a woman was used with her husband to teach another man. Okay, I mean, I didn't write it. Okay, if you don't like it, what do they say? Lump it, bump it. Whatever. Hogwash. If a married couple knows something, there's nothing wrong with them sitting down and explaining what they know to another man. This isn't the assembly. She doesn't have a title. She's not in a pulpit. She's under the auspices and the authority of her husband. And Apollos don't care because there's probably some cookies and biscuits and stuff. So he was probably more than happy to have her there helping. Otherwise, two dudes in a tree, picking ants off each other's shoulders or whatever, talking about the Bible. You're going to be hungry dudes. I know that's a lot of speculation, but I think it's funny. But anyway, so how the brethren get all wound up. So I like to poke at it once in a while when I get a chance, just to lighten them up a little bit. So now Apollos is brought up to speed, right? Okay, so now he's brought up to speed with what Aquila and Priscilla know, what they learned from Paul. And Apollos has never even met Paul. In verse 27, and when he was disposed to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him, who, when he was come, helped them much which had believed through grace. For he mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. Okay, now that's saying a lot. Because Apollos comes to Ephesus, meets Priscilla and Aquila, who learned at the foot of Paul for at least 18 months. So, how can you know a whole ton in 18 months? You can know a lot in 18 months if that's all you're doing. If you're paying attention and reading and talking Bible constantly for 18 months, you can learn a ton. More than most Christians learn in 10 years. Because they don't do that. They don't, meditate on it all the time like they should. So Apollos, never having met Paul, he's brought up to speed. He goes to Corinth, right? This church is already there, right? Priscilla and Aquila, the disciples there, sent letters with them saying, hey, receive this guy. We know him. Okay, he's good, right? They're going in their name, right? He's going in their name, and he goes there. And he was able to do what Paul wasn't able to do, which was convince the Jews mightily. The Jews ran him out of town. He didn't have much success with the Jews. Paul did not have much success with the Jews. Apollos shows up. He did. He did something Paul couldn't even do. And it might have been on purpose. I don't know. God knows what his plan is. But I said all that because I'm trying to give you the background into the division in this church for why Paul feels the need to defend himself in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and 11, because it's a complete defense of his ministry. And if you recall, without me having you turn it there, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the first time he wrote, so when does that happen? So after this Apollos thing happens, right, Paul comes back to Ephesus, And he stays there for 27 months. That's 2.5 years. And while he's there, he writes 1 Corinthians. And if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, what does he say? He says, well, let's look at it real quick. It's not that far to turn, right? It's not that hard. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse number 11. For it hath been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. So Paul hears about these contentions. Now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, I am of who? Apollos, and I of Cephas, and I of Christ. Now Cephas is Peter. We don't have any recollection of Peter being there, so then it begs the question, well, why would some say they're of Peter? We don't know Peter's even ever been to Corinth. Right? But people from Corinth were at Pentecost, which today is Pentecost, by the way. John reminded me of that. Today is Pentecost. At Pentecost, men from all over the world were there. Who was preaching at Pentecost?
Peter.
Yeah. Some people got saved, but then they went home to Corinth. That's how they could say, I'm of Cephas. Peter hadn't been to Corinth, but they had been to Peter in Jerusalem. Otherwise, I don't know how else to satisfy that contention there. Makes sense to me. It's Bible. So now you know why the Corinthians were constantly fighting. Well, Apollos is my guy. I was saved by Apollos. I was saved by Paul. Well, I was saved by Peter. You see what I'm saying? They're getting all over who their guru is, who their guy is. Right? So there's all this contention in that church. Paul had spent 18 months with them. So now that gets us back to our home. Let's hear in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. So let's get moving there. So that's where we're supposed to be. But this was important information to set the table for what otherwise it's just words, and Paul is just, blathering on about who he is and why, and it seems kind of petty, and what's the point? There's problems in this church. There's problems in this Corinthian church. We taught through 1 Corinthians, so you know what some of those problems were. But Paul has to defend himself because he's being gossiped about in that church there in Corinth. So a preacher left off at verse number 6 last week of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, talking about how our battle is spiritual, not carnal. And it's important. So verse number 1, he says, Now I, Paul, myself beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. Again, I'm not going to re-preach everything that he said here, but this also sets the table. If you go back to chapter 1 of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, it's Paul. This letter is written in the name of Paul and Timothy. Right? So it's addressed, Paul and Timothy are writing this to you. Right? Here, the first 9 chapters, he's discussing things. The most recent topic was giving, chapter 9. And now he's pivoting to a whole new discussion. Now he's getting to the gossip. Now he's getting to defend himself. Right? He took care of all that other stuff because in this epistle, he's actively trying to gather up offerings for Jerusalem. Right? Because after he leaves here, as a matter of fact, he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 that he was going to come soon to them. There's no record that he ever did go back there again, but there's some circumstantial evidence that he might have made one other visit. But he wants to take up an offering, right, for the saints at Jerusalem. And so he wants to stop by Corinth because he's going through Macedonia too, and he's going to collect things from Philippi and Thessalonica and so forth. And he wants to go to Corinth and take up an offering and take it to Jerusalem. This is his intention. Right? So he's getting ready to go back to Corinth, but he knows there's all this controversy over who he is. Like he's got no standing. Like there's these false teachers that are giving him a bad name. Right? So he feels the need to address that before he shows up. So what he does here in verse number 1 of chapter 10, now I, Paul, myself beseech you. He's leaving Timothy out of it. He's removing Timothy from his remarks. He's protecting Timothy. Okay? This is me talking now. This is just me. This is my voice right now. This is not the church. This is not me and Timothy. This is just me. I thought that was wise. Yeah. Right? It protects Timothy, because Timothy's is very important to Paul's ministry. He's doing a lot of running around, bringing letters here, and doing a lot of stuff for Paul. A very important man. And he doesn't want what he's about to say to stain Timothy's name, right? So he's given a little bit of distance between him and Timothy here. Don't put this on Timothy, right? So if Timothy shows up, don't blame him for anything that I say from here forward. And so he says, I, Paul, myself beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in the presence am base among you, but being absent am bold toward you. But I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence, wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. Because some of them people, they don't know Paul. They've never even met Paul, remember? A lot of these guys got saved after Paul had already left, right? For we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. So he's kind of acknowledging his enemy. It's a spiritual thing going on here. These gossipers, it's a spiritual thing. It's an attack from the devil, but he's using these people to do it. For we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations of every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Of course, because soldiers have to focus, right? So if our warfare is a spiritual warfare, you got to cast aside all this noise in your head. You got to focus. Cast all that stuff aside. Focus on your mission. What is your duty? What is your calling? What are you supposed to be doing? Right? Block all that noise out, because it's a spiritual battle in your head. Even if it's something benign, but if it's a distraction, it's accomplishing its purpose. It's distracting you. You can't fight a battle like that. You got to be focused. That's what that's saying, and of course, Pastor Dan filled all that out for us last week, so I'm not going to belabor that. So, and having in readiness, verse 6, to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. So he's basically saying, I have the power and the readiness to revenge. And now he's going to establish his authority. 7, do you look on things after the outward appearance? If any man trust to himself that he is Christ, let him of himself think this again, that as he is Christ's, even so are we Christ's. Remember, he says he's base among them and all that, verse number 1. In the gossip that's going on in this church, he's reminding them, look, they're bragging themselves to be of Christ, but so are we. So are we. You can't just dismiss who we are just because these other people are boasting of themselves. You can't just dismiss that. So he's going to defend himself here. Do you look on after the outward appearance? Yeah, I don't look like this great guy or whatever. So apparently Paul's acknowledging that, I'm not the greatest looking guy in the world, but what's that got to do with anything? That's his point. How could you get distracted by that? What does that mean? But that's what people do.
Right. Absolutely.
Look at the most successful preachers. Got the $10,000 smile, the $30,000 suit, the 80,000 people in the auditorium, and they're making a killing money-wise because people are fooled. They're fooled. They're fooled by that. But let that preacher with the Spirit of God get up with some coveralls and a t-shirt on and start preaching the Word of God, and you just dismiss it because, what's this guy know? Jesus said, judge not by the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Right? Don't get distracted by what you see. We're witnessing it right now in our society. You saw a video. It was tragic. But you didn't wait for anything else to come out. You just instantly judged by the appearance. Racism. You have no idea what the motivation was. It might have been, but how do you know that by the appearance? You don't know that. I don't know that. Nobody knows that. The only one that knows that is the guy that had his knee on his neck. He's the only one that knows that, unless he came out and said it. But I haven't seen any evidence of that. You see what I'm saying? I'm not saying it wasn't racism. I'm just pointing it out that instantly society judged by the appearance, and that's what the media does all the time. Give them an appearance, give them an appearance, give them an appearance. And they fool you because they show you a little bit. Because they know you're dumb enough to fall for the appearance. If you're a Christian, don't fall for it. Even if you're a leftist in your political ideology, if you're a Christian, stop falling for the appearance. Stop, take a deep breath, take a step back, and wait for facts and evidence. Stop being an emotional child. Just stop. We don't know anything about that thing yet, except now we're all distracted by the riots. It's like we already forgot about the guy. That's another tragedy in and of itself. Jesus said, judge not by the appearance. You don't know, I don't know, so let's stop pretending that we do know. Let's just let facts rule the day. Facts, reason, logic, things that don't burn buildings down. Judge not by the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Ironically, Samuel in 1 Samuel 16, and we'll get there obviously because we're going through 1 Samuel. He says, the Lord says there in 16 verse number 7, he says, man looketh on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. So there is a lesson about the appearance. And we've used this lesson when training people about evangelism, street preaching. We know God looks at the heart. He doesn't care what you look like. It doesn't matter to God. But the verse does say, man looks at the outward appearance. So if you're trying to reach a man, then maybe you should be concerned with your appearance. Because that's what he's looking at. Because he can't know your heart. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying put all your eggs in that basket. I'm not saying you have to dress to the nines everywhere you go. I'm not even talking about that. I'm just saying to be presentable. Just, you know what I'm saying? Just be presentable if you're going to represent Jesus. Just be presentable. If you can, just do the best you can. At least make some effort. But instead, you got these street preachers all over the stinking country that look like absolute clowns and buffoons. And they think they're going to reach somebody when their preacher's got a suit or a dress with a backward collar. Why is he going to listen to you? You don't even look like you can have a job, let alone know anything of what you're talking about. Now, you might be a genius, but you're probably not, because look at how you dress yourself. Not too smart. I just wanted to throw that in there because you can't just dismiss the appearance. Amen. Now, as Christians, we know our battle is spiritual. So we know we need to not judge by the appearance. But carnal people that have no concept of any of this stuff, they will judge by the appearance. Doesn't make it right, but that's what they're going to judge. So if you're trying to reach them, then take that into account at some point. That's all. That's why people dress up to go to church, because they like to. Don't have to, but they just like to. Nothing wrong with that. So Paul's like, look, man, are you guys judging by the appearance? Seriously? This is what Paul's saying. Stop that. What does what I look like have anything to do with whether what I'm telling you is from God or not? Do you look on things after the outward appearance? Lost men do. They've got no other. But that shouldn't be the testimony of a saved man. We shouldn't be looking at the outward appearance. Even though we know that that's part of our makeup and we have to overcome that sometimes, judging the book by its cover, that kind of thing, right? We do that all the time. We need to stop that. Because we're Christians. You can't expect lost people to. Well, they should too. But You can't expect them to do that. It shouldn't be the expectation. And if they do have the wisdom to not judge by appearance, then awesome, that's great. But that shouldn't be our expectation going in until we know different. Do you look on things after the outward appearance? If any man trusts to himself that he is Christ's, let him of himself think this again, that as he is Christ, even so are we Christ. So Paul's saying, I'm Christ too. I'm Christ's too. It's because you got these guys there because he's not there, right? So he's at a disadvantage. They know these guys, right? Now, some in that church know him because he led them to the Lord, but obviously there's enough people there that don't know him that there's enough room to sow seeds of misinformation. The ones that would know Paul wouldn't fall for it. Right. But this church is not full of people that know Paul. There's been other players involved. And so that can happen. And we shouldn't do that. Verse 8, for though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us, for edification and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed. So Paul's sort of gently asserting himself here. He's going to get a little tougher here soon. But he's beginning the subject here. He's beginning to defend his ministry. And he flat out says that, okay, those guys are boasting. Well, guess what? If you indulge me for a moment, I can do that and more. Because Jesus himself sent me to this. Jesus himself met me in the road to Damascus. Jesus himself converted me. Jesus himself took time to teach me. Jesus himself sent me on the mission. I didn't even want to come over here. Remember? His heart was to go east. God had to convince him to go there in the first place. He didn't even want to go there. But you don't know that if you don't know Acts. Right? That's how important Acts is to your interpretation of Paul's letters. You don't know Acts, you don't really know everything that he's saying. You just don't. So he's like, if you were to go to Acts chapter 22 and Acts chapter... You can't just go to Acts chapter 9 in the, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? If you go to Acts chapter 22 and Acts chapter 26, now he's writing 2 Corinthians right around the time of Acts 19, which is Ephesus and Diana of the Ephesians. He's in Ephesus at that point, and he's writing this letter to the Corinthians. Acts chapter 22, after his arrest hasn't even happened yet, or right when he was getting arrested, is Acts chapter 22. Acts chapter 26 is when he's brought before Agrippa, and there's all this contention going about who he is and whether he broke any laws or anything. And in those testimonies that he's giving, first to the Jews in Jerusalem in chapter 22, when they're about to kill him, and Lysias, the captain, had to save his bacon there twice. And then in Acts chapter 26, he's in Caesarea and he's brought before Agrippa. He gives a full description of of the account of Acts chapter 9. You don't get it all in Acts chapter 9. You get way more in Acts chapter 22 and Acts chapter 26. And I won't take you there, but this is where he says Jesus told him to go to the Gentiles to turn them from darkness to light. And tells him that he tells Agrippa that he used to persecute Christians, and and he brags on his stock of being a Pharisee and all that other kind of stuff. Go ahead and read Acts chapter 22 and chapter 26. If you're not familiar with the text I'm talking about, to save time, I'm not going to go there. But he could brag on all that. These gossipers in Corinth, they can't come anywhere close to what Paul could brag about. That's what he's saying. It's like if they want to play the boasting game, really don't like to have to do that, but if I did, I could boast more than they could. And they've put him in that situation to have to do that because they're gossiping about him. At some point, you got to stand up and defend yourself for your testimony's sake. Right. You can't just let gossip and falsehoods about you go unchecked. And so Paul's delicately trying not to boast because he knows pride can kick in. He's trying to protect himself from his own pride. That's why he never brings it up, but they're forcing him to bring it up. So you can kind of see him equivocating between, I don't want to boast, but then he does, and then I shouldn't do this, and then I do, and then he does. And it's like he's struggling here, but he knows he has to defend himself. But he wants to do it not from a center of pride, but of righteousness. Right? And charity and grace. And so you can tell he's really struggling here to really, because he's not comfortable. What I love about it is he's not comfortable talking about himself. That's a great thing to take away from this. That he's not comfortable talking about himself. That tells you his heart right there. He doesn't like it, but it's necessary, and that's what he's doing at this point. It says, verse 8, for though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us, but then he qualifies it, for edification and not for your destruction. I should not be ashamed. I shouldn't be ashamed of that I don't destroy you. I was given this charge to edify you, not destroy you. And if he starts bragging about this, he could absolutely go overboard with it and hurt some people, and that's not his intention. Because he knows the charge was given to him for their edification, to uplift them, to put them up higher, and not to their destruction. But he says, I should not be ashamed. Verse 9, that I may not seem as if I would terrify you by letters. He doesn't want to be guns a-blazing in his epistle, right? For his letters, now get this, these next two words are very important. For his letters, say they, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. It's gossip. That's just what they're saying. Now remember, what letters would they be appealing to? We know 1 Corinthians was already sent there, and he blasted them. Rightfully so. I can't teach all of 1 Corinthians to remind you all that. Remember, they were babes, they were carnal. They had the incestuous man in there. They didn't, the little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. And he's like, can't you even judge the smallest matters? What's wrong with you guys? Right? So he blasted them pretty good there in 1 Corinthians. So they had that letter. And so they're like, see, all he does is criticize you guys. I don't know exactly what they're saying, but clearly they're disparaging Paul. Right? When he's here, he's all nice and polite, but in his letters, he's acting like a tough guy. And they're using that against Paul. You know how in letters you can be a little bit more direct? Because you're speaking to a whole group of people. Like in his letters, he's writing to the whole church. He's not writing to Bill. Right? He's writing to the whole church. But when he shows up, he doesn't come out guns a-blazing. When he's there, he's not all Mr. Tough Guy. Because there's baby Christians, there's new people he hasn't met yet, It's like, that's not the time to sit there and come out guns a-blazing to people that don't even know you. That doesn't mean he was wrong for being tougher in a letter than he was in person. I think that's wise. I think the fault lies with people that can't handle truth. You see it in social media in a way. You'll talk tough on a thing, but when I see you, well, what do you want me to do? Just be constantly in your face when I'm in your presence? We're talking through a medium that happens to be writing. Yes, it is easier to be tougher when you're writing than it is to be face to face. That's a fact. You all know it. You do it. We all do it. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It doesn't dismiss what you said, right? But they're trying to use that against Paul because he has diplomacy. He's not being fake. It's just they're conflating the two different ways of communicating and trying to use that against Paul. That's actually normal for people to be tougher in writing. That's why I think people were a lot more mature back in the days when they had to handwrite letters to people and send it through the mail. Because they had to communicate more often through writing than through face-to-face. Like if your children move 3 states away, you might see them once or twice the rest of their life. Ever. But you write letters to them every week. So you get really, really good at communicating by writing. Not anymore. It's just crazy. I'm one of those grammar snobs too. I do my best. The only kind of like shortcuts I take is like LOL. But like I'm still writing full sentences, the whole word. I'm not using the you and the number two and it drives me crazy. But that's just because I'm an old guy. But I think there's something to that in communication, though. I think it just, I don't know. But Paul was being disparaged by their gossip. Verse 11, let such an one think this, the persons that's gossiping about him. If you think that's true about me, that my letters are weighty and powerful, but in bodily presence I'm weak and my speech contemptible, let such an one think this, that such as we are in word by letters when we are absent, such will we be also indeed when we are present. So the people that know Paul would know this to be true. The people that don't know Paul wouldn't have a clue, and therefore they're being sold to bill of goods by these false teachers that are trying to take over this church. And so they're gossiping about Paul. And Paul's basically just saying, oh, fine. I'll be that way when I come too. Because he's got a point to prove now. Right? Because all this bad talk about him is going on in Corinth and he's going to defend himself. Verse 12, for we dare not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves are not wise. See, here's the problem. Paul knows what he's done. The Lord knows what he's done. The Lord's been with him on all this. He's seen the power of God, the miracles that God does. He's been part of starting all these churches, seeing lives change, seeing churches grow, all those things. These guys are in Corinth. They don't know anything. They don't know anything of what Paul's done. So this is what he means here by comparing themselves with themselves are not wise. This is like a schoolyard with 10-year-old boys playing basketball, and they're comparing themselves among themselves, and they think that, the guy that's the best 10-year-old, he's comparing himself to the other 10-year-olds, and he's the man. I'm the man. But Michael Jordan's about to show up. You ain't nothing. You should be comparing yourselves to those that excel you. Right. Not comparing yourself to the low bar. Right. He's not telling you not to compare. He's telling you don't compare yourselves with your peers. Because there's some people that can excel you. That is who you should be comparing yourself to. I don't know anything. Right? You get a couple of dunces and put them in a room. One of them's the genius. Right? I know that's a kind of an extreme example, but right? And this is how you got cities burning down. Because they're all geniuses. They got it figured out. I saw a man, boy, my heart broke. And I don't know if it was related to this thing in Minneapolis today or if it's an older clip. But it was a riot here in the United States. So I don't know if it was Baltimore a couple years ago or if it was Ferguson years before that or whatever. I don't know. But it was so heartbreaking because here's this man who's probably 60 years old. Black man. And there's these rioters all around him. And they're doing their thing. They're smashing windows. They're burning things up. And it's his business. And he starts crying and screaming at these, why are you doing this to me? What do I have to do with all this? Why are you destroying my business? I mean, this guy's crying as he's yelling. Why do you destroy my truck? Why do you destroy my business? I've spent my whole life working to build this, and you're destroying it all. Don't you even know what you're doing? They didn't have a clue. Why? Because they see that person breaking a window, so I can break a window. They see that guy throwing a fire bomb, I'm going to throw a fire bomb. They're comparing themselves with themselves, and they're not wise. And that's what's happening. You got a bunch of fools, a bunch of angry, bitter, hateful people stirred up by satanic media. It's all satanic. I'm not saying they worship the devil. I'm just saying it's clearly satanic manipulation. When people can boldly lie like they do on news media. I mean, this isn't like difference of opinion stuff. These are flat out lies.
Right.
I loved it the other day. You know, prior to the riots and all that, right? The big thing was, oh, you're a hateful, selfish person because you don't have a mask on. So, of course, the leftists all rally around. They're virtue signaling. People are driving down the street with masks on in their car. And I'm like, a moron. You're going to get sick in your own car by yourself?
Right.
That's virtue signaling. I'm better than you. I've got my mask on. That's all that is. It's so childish. It's stupid. You can't be that dumb. It's either you're that dumb or you're, I'm better than you. And neither one of those is good. Anyway, that was the big deal, you know. You got to have your mask on. So there's this CNN guy with the mask on, right? They all got their masks on because those evil conservatives were protesting and they didn't all have masks on. So they're going to show how bad those people are. They don't care about you. They're selfish. They want you to die. They don't care. They're going to spread the virus. They're going to make it worse. They're going to kill our family members. Blood is on their hands. And so this guy's got the mask on. It's so hilarious. And he's doing a report. And he's showing all these people out and about, right? And there's this guy, like, in the background, just off to the side. He's only like 5 feet away, but he's in the screenshot, right? He's got a Green Bay Packers jersey on. And he's standing there, and he's listening to the reporter. And the reporter says, yeah, there's all these people out here gathering around and ignoring social distancing, and not everyone has their masks on. And the guy goes, you mean like your cameraman and half your crew?
Yeah.
And the guy's like, yeah, like that, like the cameraman, and he's like just downtrodden. It's like wah 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 wah. The gig is up, liar. Just liars, man. This stuff drives me crazy, doesn't it? Untruthfulness just drives me nuts. I don't care if I disagree with you if you're telling me the truth,
Right.
or even if you believe it's true. This guy's flat out lying on the news, and guess what? My neighbors are buying it all, hook, line, and sinker, and that makes me even madder. More upset. It's not even a word, madder, but. More angry. It's not right. It's not true. And our entire society is led like by a leash with falsehoods and darkness and lies, and you can see it all because they're comparing themselves with themselves. That's what they're doing. Look at me. Look at me. We're better than them. And they're worse. They're worse because they're faking it. That's what makes it bad. I'm not saying they're bad because they wear a mask or they don't wear a mask. I'm not saying people are right for not wearing a mask or wearing a mask. All I'm saying is what you believe in your convictions, more power to you. You should do that. That's what you're led to do. Do it. Don't lie about it. Stop. Everything they do is lies. And I'm not even talking about the Republicans either. It's not like they're that much better, but they're not like blatantly in your face lying and encouraging people to blow things up. You got Congress people encouraging people to riot. When is that not treason?
Right.
It's like nothing matters anymore, and that's the frustrating part. The FBI can do whatever they want. They can frame people, nobody goes to jail. You can burn down buildings, nobody gets arrested. Every man does that which is right in his own eyes. That's where we're headed. If we're not already there full bore.
Right. Absolutely.
It's not going to end well. It's not. And then, okay, so what does our government do? If it does what it should do, they're going to go, see, I told you. Because what they should do is start rolling down the streets with tanks and armored vehicles and hammering these clowns. I'm not saying kill them. but hammering them, like arresting them, getting the dogs out and tackling them, putting cuffs on them, water hose them, stop the rioting. They're hurting people. They're hurting people. But if they do that, then they'll say, see, the government is evil and wants to hurt you. They're masters. They're masters at sowing such an evil and wicked web of deception that you can't even do anything without falling into the trap. The government's evil and they just want to hurt people and it's police brutality, right? So then you riot and then they get brutal on you and see, I told you. So what are you supposed to do? You know, the government that wants to do right can't do right. They should do right, but it's an election year. Right. And they know it. So the politicians always have their hands tied. If you let the police chiefs and the generals do their thing, they don't care. They're not elected. It'll be over yesterday. It'd have been done already. Because politicians run the whole thing. And they're comparing themselves with themselves and they're not wise. You shouldn't compare yourselves with yourselves. I'm the best. Find somebody better and then come talk to me. That'll humble you. And that's what Paul's talking about. They were comparing themselves with themselves and they're not wise. And he's kind of like subtly, and I'm going to wrap it up, he's kind of like subtly trying not to boast of himself. But basically he's like, I'm Michael Jordan. And if you want, I can come down there and I can really show you how to play basketball. But you think you're doing anything? Because you're the best 10-year-old that can hit a couple layups against other 10-year-olds? Because he's the master. But he's too humble to say that. But it's kind of what he's saying. They're not wise. And then I'll finish it on verse number 13, because this is where he says, but we will not boast of things without our measure. I'm not going to boast of things that I can't boast about. He's been given a measure. But according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. I was told by the Lord in a vision to come to you in the first place. And those guys that are disparaging me cannot say that. And they're going to disparage me? There wouldn't even be a church there if it weren't for me. And of course, it's like glory unto the Lord. He's going to get to that here right near the end of the chapter. Give glory unto God for that. But he's been put into a bad position to have to defend himself because he's writing them letters. And if his name doesn't mean anything, then his letters won't mean anything. So he's literally defending the word of God, as he's writing it. So we'll leave it right there, and then we'll start off right there, verse number 13. Next week, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse number 13.